After I called it as happening last month, I'd really hoped that we would never have to talk about it again. I'd hoped that I was wrong, and I'd hoped that people would just let it go. But here we are, a couple weeks after the midterms, and we have to talk again about the fact that our United States Senate is under attack. After a very hard-fought battle that Senate Democrats fought to keep Justice Brett Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court, thus giving them campaign material in order to use to tell the American people to vote for them so they could keep Justice Brett Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court, the American populace, especially the Hollywood elite, started coming out and telling us why the Supreme Court was bad and why we didn't need it anymore, and most of it came down to population. I'll link the video in the description below and on the end cap, but for now I'll give you just a quick little rehash of what we talked about in there for time's sake so we can keep watching this video instead of clicking back and forth between videos. Big Bang star Johnny Galecki put an Instagram post up shortly after the Kavanaugh confirmation that stated that the senators that confirmed Kavanaugh represented the minority of people in the country, and the senators that voted to deny Kavanaugh his seat on the Supreme Court represented the majority, the fact that our system was broken, and the fact that the Senate needed to be rethought. And that was the first time I realized that the Senate was going to come under attack in the near future, and it was going to come under attack under the concept of majority or mob rule across the country. The United States Senate is a unique body of government around the world, and it represents a great compromise that our country put together in order to federalize the country rather than having a loose confederacy of different small, we could call them countries, that had no sorts of interstate laws and essentially operated autonomously and kept their own militaries and currency. Our founders knew that without a standing federal army and a standing federal government, all of the little states, especially places like Rhode Island in the original 13 colonies, stood a great chance of being reabsorbed after an attack by Britain or by any other European state that had stake in the area and had an interest in gathering the resources that they were lacking in their home countries. Our founders wanted a federal government, but they did want an autonomy among the states, and they wanted representation equal for all of the states so that the will of New York did not overtake the will of places like Rhode Island or New Hampshire. The original methodology for putting people in the Senate was very unique as well, and it fell into a unique series of methodologies for putting people into the government in general across the country in order to make sure that the will of the smaller states was not absorbed by the will of the smaller states, and yet the larger states still got some sort of say in the government. The larger states at the time elected the House of Representatives. The House has a number of representatives that reflects among the population of the states and was one of the more powerful bodies of government in the initial form of government. These people were directly elected by the people of their states based on a popular vote in the various districts of the original 13 states. The president was elected by having a representative that was representative in and of itself of the number of representatives that each state had plus 2 to account for the Senate. So the president was never directly elected by the people, and it was never framed that way so that New York could not put up every single president until the end of time, considering the fact that the founders only knew of the original 13 states. The Supreme Court had no say from the people at all anywhere in the government. The president appointed each Supreme Court justice, and the Senate would confirm the Supreme Court justice. And then there was the Senate. In the initial founding of our country, the United States Senate was comprised of representatives that each state's individual legislation put into place rather than by the will of the people. The Senate got equal representation no matter what the population size was and provided checks to the House of Representatives. As I've mentioned twice now, making sure that states like New York and Massachusetts didn't overtake the wills of states like Rhode Island and New Hampshire. The initial methodology for electing people to Senate was, in my opinion, a way for the founders to make sure that people didn't ignore their state and local governance in a time where the federal government was going to grow, because all governments are designed to grow. The methodology for putting people into the Senate has changed and now has become a popular vote among the entirety of each state in order to choose each of their 2 senators when their terms come up. But I do kind of miss the old way that the senators were elected, even though it wasn't going on at any point in my lifetime. If your state legislature was responsible for putting people into Congress to represent you in the Senate, then you had much more incentive to pay attention to who you were putting in your state house and in your legislative houses in your individual states. You didn't have to pay attention to what was going on a national level for the Senate. You just had to make sure that you put the right people into your state assemblies in order for them to put the people that would represent you best into the Senate. And that all changed with the 17th Amendment. I knew that we were going to have a talk about the Senate again as soon as the midterms were over, and I realized the fact that the Democrats were not going to take the Senate in a gigantic blue wave. In essence, I knew that this was going to happen long before the election, even because I knew that the Senate was not going to turn over to the Democrats in this 2018 midterm. But I had faith that the losses in the House of Representatives would have distracted them from the Senate. Our gridlocked government now makes me realize that the Democrats across the country feel that they do need to have control over everything, no matter what the cost and no matter what they do. In essence, right now, the argument is the fact that if you are not winning the game, then you have to change the rules to make sure that you continue winning the game. And that's what we're here to talk about today. While I was scrolling through Twitter earlier on in the week, I saw a post from a random blue checkmark that I had never heard of in my life. It was a retweet from another one of my followers, so I sat back and I read the post and I went back into the originality of the post. Let's see what Max Berger has to say. Max Berger's tweet is a caption onto a picture. The picture has a caption in and of itself that reads, "Maybe a bunch of white slave owners from the 1700s did not come up with the best government ever." And then they cited the fact that Alaska, Hawaii, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Arkansas, Mississippi, West Virginia, D.C., Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine have the same population as the state of California. And yet there are 46 senators among the states that I listed initially and only 2 senators from California. Berger goes on to say that he thinks that it's time that we start talking about this. This, of course, follows in the same spirit of a tweet that was put out by George Takei, who has since blocked me on Twitter, that says essentially the same thing. There is a 64-1 population differential between Wyoming and his home state of California, and yet they have the same representation in the Senate. I think the tweet that got me blocked was when I replied back and reminded him of the fact that he also has 57 representatives in the country, whereas my state of Wisconsin only has 7. Now, this has actually been a long-standing argument among the left, and it actually started right about the time that Donald Trump was elected, and the people on the left decided that they didn't like the Electoral College anymore, in spite of the fact that they loved it when Mitt Romney ceded the election to Barack Obama, because Barack Obama was far up in electoral votes, but at the time of the secession which since changed after all of the votes were tallied, Romney was up in the popular vote. When a Democrat is up in the electoral vote, the Democrats sing its praises. When a Republican is up and wins the electoral vote, now it's time to abolish the entire electoral college, and the Senate is the exact same way. Now, one of the things that's blown me away about this fight about the Senate is the members of the Senate and how they interact with their voters. And I think a part of that is because they believe and understand that nothing's actually going to happen. We'll talk about that later in the video. But I'm very surprised when I go through Twitter and I see Kamala Harris running out and trying to play to her base. And I look at Bernie Sanders and I see him trying to run out and play to his base. I see these people trying to get support from their bases around the country in their individual states, and I look back at the messaging that their constituency and the people that they represent feel about them and their house of government in general. I didn't say it on my Senate video the last time, but I'll say it this time. I would not be doing the same thing if I was Kamala Harris. If I was Kamala Harris and my base started talking about me and the way that my job and my career was going to go in the future, the way that the people on the left are talking about the Senate now, I would have birds up in the air, quickly and easily. Harris is showing tremendous composure right now, considering the fact that the majority of people who voted for her would like to see her and all of the rest of the people in her chamber of legislation out of a job right now, instead having our entire country represented in a unicameral fashion by representatives which represent the interests of the largest states in our country. With that being said, let's have a for instance. Let's talk about what happens if the Democrats succeed and we tear up the Constitution and start it all over again. Actually, let's step back and go a little bit of a simpler route first. Let's see what happens if we try to put an amendment in place to disband the Senate, which would be the most logical course of action under the Constitution without tearing the Constitution up and ending our government as we know it. The conservative punditry around the country, and especially on the national level, talked a lot about what would happen if we tried to repeal the Second Amendment and what it would take to do so. So it would stand to reason that any other amendment in the Constitution would require the same effort and the same steps. In order for a constitutional amendment to go through, it first has to be proposed and pass both houses and the presidency. If you're trying to disband the Senate, good luck getting that through the Senate. Then the states of the Union have to come together and call a convention of the states, in which 2/3 of the states would have to ratify the amendment to make it legal and add it to the Constitution. When Berger made up the map, he pointed out the fact that it took 23 states to make up 40 million population in equivalency to California's population of 40 million. That means that you would lose just about half of your states right then and there, and you'd never get to 2/3 across the country unless there was some major crisis in which you could actually convince these smaller states to give up their representation willingly and bend to the will of California and New York. I don't see any of that happening anywhere. The exact same thing would happen if we decided to just tear up the Constitution and start over. Once again, you would have to find these smaller population states which would, while the Constitution was torn up, be their own independent autonomous nations and request and beg for them to come in and join your new federation, your new union of states, where they would have almost no representation when it came compared to California, Illinois, New York, and Florida. Once again, we would be going back to a nation in which these large states would be calling the shots for all of the smaller states. And you'd never be able to get places like North Dakota, Minnesota, or Wisconsin to sign on to that. If Californians want more Senate representation, one of the most obvious things that they could do would be to split up their state. There are 40 million people in a relatively small area of the state, so breaking that state up into two or three or maybe even six different individual states, as has been suggested in the past, would mean that you would gain two or four or maybe even 10 more senators in the Senate, and you would get a more equal and even representation. You could split your state up into a way that would make sense for you and still have your population grasp among the Senate. Now, one of the obvious problems that comes with splitting up California in order to gain more representation in the United States Senate would be how to draw the lines in order to get the end goal that they seem to want to get. Depending on how you draw and gerrymander the lines in a split California, especially if you go six ways, there is no guarantee that you are going to find a way to get all of your senators to be Democrats. This is a little bit easier when you go to smaller and smaller numbers of splits, but as you go into more and more splits, you run the risk of putting more Republicans into the Senate, and I don't think Los Angeles Democrats are very interested in the idea. Additionally, depending on where you draw the lines, you would have additional barter systems and interstate regulations that you would have to put through in order to get more resources over into resource-starved Los Angeles. If that doesn't work, or you can't get the initiative to the ballot out in California, there is one other idea and solution that you could try and put into place as a Californian that feels underrepresented in the U.S. government, in the Senate especially. I know it's an unpopular idea to the more rural states in this country because they fear that Californians fleeing California will bring their California values with them and vote for them in their new states. But you do have the opportunity as well if the people were to disperse and the population density of California were to become much lower, especially if they lower the density of places like Los Angeles. Obviously, you're going to have a strain on resources right away, and you're going to have to build housing and more businesses to accommodate the people who have dispersed into some of these more rural and open states, places like Montana and Arizona. But the trade-off to doing things like that is you have the opportunity to make friends with your new neighbors. I know it's been getting harder and harder in the age of social media, but you could make friends with your new California neighbors and try and introduce them more into the values that have made your state great and have made your state into the rural powerhouse that it is. The places that have made it worth it for people who want the peace and quiet to get the peace and quiet. And honestly, if you disperse them more evenly through your states than they are currently concentrated in California, I think you run the chance of being able to get the people out there and out of their California echo chamber and able to see that the middle of the country, the flyover that they abscond every time there's an election, really isn't that bad. And it can show them the reasons that we do need a representation in this country rather than just bending to the will of California. But that's just me spitballing at this point. Ultimately, right now, the Senate is safe. There's no scenario out there other than secession of the states that feel that they're underrepresented in the Senate, in which that they can change the Constitution while still keeping the votes and the statehoods of places like North Dakota. As far as elections go, I do think that Californians should double down and try and impose on us more of a population-based Senate. I would love to see people from California tell people from Oklahoma why their voices don't matter and why we should just accept California rule across this country and not question it anymore because California has the biggest population. I'd love to see that conversation. I think it would go over perfectly. And I think that it would drive the people in flyover country out to vote and try and strip the powers of California even further than they already are by their underrepresentation in the Senate. What do you think about Senate representation? What do you think about its fairness? And if you don't think it's fair, what is it that you could change? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at edsblog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.
You're always there.